Hello and welcome to another video getting you the very top grades. Today I'm starting a new series where I look at the top 10 things in an inspector's calls, and I'm going to start with top 10 reasons why. Priestley wrote the play. Many people think it's all about capitalism and socialism and the rights of workers, which is true, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is actually that he wanted to prevent future wars. And so here is the quotation: "Fire and blood and anguish," that is the inspector's last words to the characters, and they come from Priestley's experience of the First World War. So he was 22 years old when it finished. He joined when he was 17 years old, which means that he was there for the duration. Not as many people died as is thought in popular culture. So 1 in 10 soldiers died. I mean, that is enormous, don't get me wrong, that's huge, but it's not what you would probably think, which is a third or even a half of soldiers being slaughtered. However, for Priestley's generation, starting at the beginning of the war, it would have been much greater than 1 in 10. And this is why the play is structured around the 2 deaths of Eva Smith. The first death is equivalent to the First World War, and the second death equivalent to the Second World War. And the second death happens, that final telephone call occurs, because the Burlings don't learn their lesson. And this is Priestley's main point. The ruling classes didn't learn their lesson after the First World War. And what has this got to do with socialism? Well, Priestley believed that it's the capitalist system that leads us to go to war. The rulers of the country wouldn't have gone to war unless they could make an enormous amount of money from it. And that, he's arguing, is one of the motivations of both world wars. Because it is the hard-headed man of business, the one that Burling claims he is, it's those hard-headed men who have made all the money out of manufacturing the bullets, the aeroplanes, the engines, the battleships, stitching together all the uniforms. Burling is a clothing manufacturer, isn't he? Or at least creating the cotton for those clothes. And so he and people like him made an absolute fortune out of the First World War and did the same in the Second. And that's why Priestley's attack against capitalism isn't just about protecting workers' rights. He's protesting against the loss of workers' lives. And this is why this is an anti-war play as much as it is an anti-exploitation of the working classes play. Okay, you also know from this quotation about it being about the millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths, again, the inspector's words, that he is obviously attacking the exploitation of workers. And I don't need to explain to you how that works, because you will have learnt all that in class. However, there is some historical context which might really help you. So one of the interesting things is that there were loads of strikes going on before the war started, and the war was a way of stopping the strikes. So in Priestley's view, it could be that he sees people like the Burlings taking us into a war in order to stop industrial unrest. And then after the war, that unrest started again. You have the massive general strike of 1926, and then the failure of capitalism in 1929, when we had the Great Crash and the Depression. Millions became unemployed, and unemployment went from 1 million in 1929 to 2.5 million in 1931. And that involved real hardships, because there was no welfare state. There was no system of providing financial security to people who were jobless. And Priestley sees that as a failure of the capitalist system, and he wants the millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths to be looked after. And so he needs to change the mind of the ruling classes, and they are the kinds of people who will be paying good money to go to the theatre. Which brings us to motive number 3. He wants to create a welfare state where the poor are provided for. We have social security now to help the poor, but that didn't exist in 1945. Instead, we've got a much greater part played by charities such as Mrs. Burling's, and this is a quotation from the inspector about her. There was a meeting of the interviewing committee 2 weeks ago. This is just before Eva commits suicide. And what you need to think about here is she obviously deserves the money. She was friendless, penniless, desperate. But her case is not only turned down, it's more than 2 weeks before the next cases are heard. In other words, this charitable system is not working, even if it operates fairly. And so Priestley is pointing out that we can't leave the welfare of poor people in the hands of rich people. We have to get governments to step in and take control. Reason number 4. I'm sure you've been taught that this is a socialist play. However, what you might not have thought about is that the people watching it in 1945 are going to be overwhelmingly female. And that's because the war has only just ended, which means there are hundreds of thousands or millions of British soldiers still in Europe or still in Asia, still fighting against the Japanese. And consequently, the men are not here. And women are going to be allowed to vote. They've been employed during the Second World War because the men have gone away to fight. There are many more jobs for women. And so Priestley realizes that for socialism to suddenly take hold, he needs to appeal to the female voter. And that's why he casts the play with such strong female roles. That's why we look at Sheila as the main person who's going to learn the socialist message, who is female. And that's why the main victim of capitalism is Eva, because she is a woman. And Priestley wants to point out that women suffer worse under the capitalist system. And now he obviously believes that's true, but it also helps his message to women that they need to vote for a socialist future, and his play is a way of demonstrating that. Another reason connected to his socialism that you might not know about is a personal one. So when the inspector is dismissed as probably a socialist or some sort of crank, this is the way that Priestley himself has been treated. Now this is fascinating. So during the Second World War, Priestley was incredibly famous, and he had a really powerful political voice because he had a show on the radio. And 40% of people listening to the radio listened to his broadcasts. To give you a perspective of that, the Bake Off figures and the Strictly Come Dancing figures, which are our 2 top TV shows, are only a third of the number of listeners that Priestley got. In other words, he's 3 times as famous as our most famous shows. He's a superstar. But Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, steps in, writes to the BBC and says this: "He's far from friendly to the government, and I should not be too sure about him on larger issues." And as a result of this political interference, Priestley was sacked by the BBC. So the only way for Priestley to get his message out into the public arena is to do it through theatre and play. And of course, all the most influential people in London would go to the theatre or have members of their family and friends who went, and so his message would spread. Okay, well, it spreads at a time when there is a new election for new government. Now, everybody expected Churchill to win because Churchill was the great hero. He had led the party to massive success in defeating Hitler. Who in their right minds would think that the government would suddenly lose this election? But they did. And one of the reasons is Priestley's focus on the problem of men. If men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. So this is again his way not just of appealing to women, but pointing out that men are at the root of the problem. It's patriarchal power, male power, patriarchal power, which has led to this tragedy of entering 2 world wars. So part of his motivation is to bring more women's voices into politics. Now, as I've just told you, there's also an element of personal revenge because he lost his job through the intervention of Churchill himself. Now, Churchill was considered a real villain by many socialists of the time because of his part in the First World War. In the First World War, Churchill initiated an attack in Turkey, in a place called Gallipoli, and through the Dardanelles Straits, took the navy in there, and it led to a massive military failure where hundreds of thousands of British troops were killed or injured. So here is a modern version of the Daily Mail, going back to Churchill's time in 1915 in the First World War. Churchill's admission, "I'm finished," as he resigns from war government. Shadow of Gallipoli disaster cut short his dazzling career. So Churchill in many ways is the very embodiment with what's wrong with the Burlings. And if you look at his clothing here, it's an exact replica of what the stage directions say that the Burlings must dress as in their tails and their bow ties for formal dress. A further political reason is that Priestley himself stood as an independent candidate to be elected in 1945. He didn't join the Labour Party, but he did actually stand as an independent candidate. He was not elected himself, but his play was part of the popular mood that led to the biggest landslide victory in modern times. The Labour Party had an enormous victory, and it was a catastrophe for the Liberals and the Conservatives, and Churchill ceased to be Prime Minister. We also have to consider, point number 9, that Churchill actually is writing from a feminist point of view. And this is before feminism even becomes part of popular culture in the 1960s. Obviously, there's a feminist movement much before that. You've probably studied the suffragettes a little bit, who were campaigning for the vote in 1912. That date should be important to you because that is when the play is set, in 1912. And that's one of the reasons that Priestley chooses 1912, because this is the beginning of the suffragette movement, and if you like, the feminist movement. And he's writing a feminist play saying that the Patriarchal Society, society ruled by men, is penalising not just women, but as a result of excluding women, making society worse for men as well. And that's why Eric and Gerald come out so badly in this play, not just to show that they're exploiting women, but also to show that they don't lead happy lives themselves. You know, that could be one reason why Eric is an alcoholic. And that's why we have this message in the play, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. Because during the Second World War, we have millions, well, not that many millions, say 2 million women, who are suddenly able to get employment, which they would not have done had there not been a war. Now these jobs suddenly become available, and women have had up to 5 years of independence and financial security where they don't depend on men. Now they stand to lose all of that if all the male soldiers return home and take their jobs. That's exactly what happened at the end of the First World War, and perhaps might have happened had a Conservative Party remained in charge. But with a new socialist government, there was a much stronger feeling towards greater equality between men and women, and many women were able to keep their jobs despite the men returning. And then the final answer, which is the most obvious one, well, he just wanted to make some money, didn't he? Which is, there's nothing wrong with that, you know, you're a professional writer. And this is true. But how does he do it? Well, he simply wants to entertain and encourage the paying public to fill his theatre night after night. And in doing that, he has this mysterious plot, which is a bit of a whodunit, and even a what on earth was done. So the police arrive at the end, the girl has just died, and a police inspector is on his way here to ask some questions. But crucially, he leaves that question as the end of the play, because he wants his audience not just to be hooked, to come back and be entertained, but also to have that question in their mind. Why is there this phone call? And that brings us back to his political message, because his question is, why did we have the Second World War? And the play's answer is, because we didn't learn the lessons of the First World War, and therefore, if we learn the lessons of the Second World War, get rid of these capitalist men who are in power, and we'll start a government of politicians who actually care about the people that they govern, and they won't send them off to die in foreign wars. Well, obviously you're not going to write about all 10 of those in any essay, are you? But you are going to write about 2 or 3 in any essay that you write, and that will make your answer so much better than everyone else in the country, who will only be writing about this one, the capitalist system and the exploitation of the ordinary working man and working woman. And that's what I mean when I keep making videos and telling you that you can get a grade 7 and above. That's what I mean. It's just a case of knowing a bit more than the other students who are going to have a less expert analysis of the play because they don't know as much as you do. Congratulations for watching. If you'd like more, don't forget to subscribe.